So on August 15th, 2025, I'll be going to a conference called Hackers on Planet Earth. And there I'll be giving a presentation called How to Hack Your Brain. And after this presentation, there'll be two other people, Xavier and Lucas, very cool people, who'll be talking about bio-cybersecurity issues related to hacking the brain. So I thought I'd record this beforehand for my YouTube audience. The few of you who watch my videos, thank you. I put a lot of hard work into it, so I appreciate that. All right, so let's get into this. This is, by the way, an image that I created. It has a lot of symbolic meaning, and that symbolism is on my website, so you can check it out. But what it also represents is the flow of my presentation today. And I'll start with methods of hacking the brain that are very invasive, and then I'll go progressively less and less invasive as the presentation goes on. Now, the most invasive you can get to hack the brain is to actually go inside the brain itself. And there'll be two examples I'll give. The first will be injecting chemicals into the brain, which is more applicable to like animal studies. And then I'll mostly focus on sticking wires into the brain. So for chemicals, here's a really cool experiment that was done that really highlights the power of hacking the brain and going right inside there. So what they did is they genetically engineered viruses, and these viruses carried a gene, and a gene that encoded a receptor. And so the setup is that they had voles, and these voles are polyamorous, so they make multiple partners, they're promiscuous, multiple sexual partners, okay? And then the gene that they took for the receptor was from a different species of voles, monogamous voles. So in any case, they take this virus with this gene from monogamous voles, they stick it into the brain of the polyamorous vole, and all of a sudden, these polyamorous voles are behaving monogamously. Now, this is extraordinary because reproduction is a very complex behavior, and yet what this highlights is that if you know what you're doing, because like they really needed to know what brain region, what receptor, and there's a lot that they had to know, but if you know it, you can make dramatic and fundamental changes to an organism by hacking their brain using this technique over here. Now, going on to the wires, which is more applicable to humans, as many of you may know, the brain is composed of neurons, and these neurons communicate through electrical pulses, and what you can do is stick a wire into the brain, and what this wire can do is eavesdrop and listen to the firing that these neurons are doing, or you can kind of inject current into it and activate it. So one of the first examples, famous experiments, was done by Wilder Penfield, and he was a neurosurgeon, and he, operated on patients that had epilepsy. He'd go into the brain and try to surgically remove that locus of epilepsy. And as he was going there and exploring the brain, he would have like a probe that would, put a little bit of electric current into the brain, stimulating it. And one of the things he noticed was that when he went down what we call now the motor cortex, different parts of your body or the patient's body would twitch pretty consistently. And so on the right here, he made a map, the homunculus map, showing the different parts of your brain and what they encode. In this case, specifically the motor cortex. But he went and he explored other parts too, and he was able to, in some patients, elicit dreams and smells and visual and auditory hallucinations, as well as outer body experiences. So this was one of the first examples of really going into the human brain and hacking it. Now the question is, many years later, what are we able to do? And it's pretty amazing. It's very science fiction-y, but this is things that people have done. So in this study, they took paralyzed patients who couldn't move, for example, their hands and feet and stuff like that, and they implanted a bunch of wires into the motor cortex. And this individual here was then able to, just by thought alone, control this robotic arm in a 3D space. And this person who had not been able to previously kind of grab a drink and drink it, for the first time in her life was able to do this just by thought alone. So it's extraordinary. And this again highlights some of the really amazing benefits that can come from this kind of brain hacking. Wow. But also, like some of these mecha anime and futuristic movies, maybe these things are possible where we can have electrodes and stuff like that stuck in our brains and spinal cord, and we can control huge machines and do fantastic things. Who knows? Now, if you're hungry for even more out there ideas, then here is a study for you. So what they did here is they took a poor little rat, and into its brain they implanted a infrared detector. Now, infrared, for those of you who may not be as familiar, it's like the movie Predator, and the Predator could kind of see infrared, these heat signatures from far away. Snakes can kind of do that. You can kind of sense infrared on your skin through temperature, but rats have no capability of seeing or sensing infrared from a distance. So they implant this detector into the brain of this rat, and surprisingly, this rat is able to learn to use it, to navigate. So now this rat has a whole new sense that it never had before. You could imagine all sorts of wild things. You could maybe create a rat that can detect magnetic fields, like a pigeon or something. So this is, again, maybe a little bit terrifying, but fascinating that they can do this sort of stuff. But what I also want to do is talk about the dangers of what could happen. There are a lot of private companies out there now that are developing technology to go invasively and stick wires into the brains of humans. Neuralink is one example. Some of them have CEOs like Elon Musk who maybe are not fans of oversight. What could go wrong if you don't have a lot of oversight? Well, I'm going to give you one extremely horrifying example. You really don't have to look too far to find these examples. Before I do that, I'll talk about one seminal study. So, in this study, what they did is they took a rat, and into the reward center of this rat, they put in an electrode, a wire. Okay, and that wire then went and was connected to a lever, and then that rat could press that rat lever, stimulating its own rewards center. And you kind of imagine what would happen. This rat essentially became an addict. It just kept stimulating its reward center over and over again to the point where it neglected food and water. So horrifying already that you can hack into the reward system of a creature and turn it into essentially an addict. Now, the next study is going to be, it's just I couldn't believe when I read what I read. So this study was in the 1970s, not even that far, long time ago. I was born in 1981, it's not that far ago. What this person did, this is published, you can see the citation right there, you can go read it. They took a 24-year-old man who had epilepsy, was depressed, was suicidal, abused drugs, really someone vulnerable, someone hurting, someone who needs help. They took this guy, and just like that rat experiment, they stuck a wire right into his reward system, and just like that rat experiment, they gave him the ability to self-stimulate. And you can imagine what happened. In just over 3 hours, this guy stimulated himself 1,500 times, and they write here, he protested each time the unit was taken from him, pleading to self-stimulate just a few more times. This is horrible because here's a person who needs help, who came to a medical place to get help and is being experimented on like a rat. And certainly, how is this going to help him, right? So this is just already really heart-shattering, really hurts. And then what you'll see next is just going to, it just blew my mind. I couldn't even believe it. So they write, one aspect of the total treatment program for this patient was to explore the possibility of altering his sexual orientation through electrical stimulation of pleasure sites of the brain. So this guy was gay, and they were trying to force him to turn into, someone who's straight. And morally, ethically, this is so fundamentally wrong. And so what they did is they first showed him heterosexual porn, and he responded, they write here, with revulsion to the film, registering angry protests. And then they let him self-stimulate himself, his reward system, while watching heterosexual porn. And then he became, as they write in their paper, he became increasingly aroused, had an erection, and masturbated to orgasm. Imagine that in a scientific paper that's published. It gets way worse than that, because then they bring in a prostitute, and they find that the patient began active participation, achieved successful penetration, which culminated in a highly satisfactory orgasmic response. Now, what's horrifying about this is, first, it shows how fundamentally human behavior can be changed when you stick these wires into the brains of people. It shows, these brain hacking techniques can be rather dangerous in the wrong hands. It can also show what happens when there's not a lot of oversight or ethics or thought into what are you doing to a human being. What I should also say is that this is a radical example, right? Where you have maybe a clear sense that you're being stimulated. But equally dangerous is that people could have stimulation that's kind of subconscious, subcognitive. They're not really aware of it, but you can nudge people in a kind of reinforcement learning way to particular behaviors if you're stimulating them without them really even knowing it. Now, those were examples of being right in the brain. Let's get a little further away. So now we're going to talk about kind of hacking the brain or the system by getting into the sensory nerves. And there are a few different examples of this. There are retinal implants, vestibular implants. I'll be talking about cochlear implants because they're pretty fascinating. They're pretty amazing. So a cochlear implant is for individuals who are deaf, who typically have damaged like biological hardware, maybe their eardrum or the little bones or something there, but their auditory nerve and their auditory cortex and all those things work fine. And so what the cochlear implant is a microphone that sits outside that can detect sound waves. And then this is what's extraordinary. Scientists have figured out what kind of electrical signals the auditory nerve needs to be able to interpret sound. So then it goes from the microphone, it goes to like a signal processor that kind of like breaks it up into frequency content, stuff like that, sends it to the auditory nerve in the form of electric signals. And it's not the same thing as like hearing with a biological ear, but people's brains are able to adapt and remap, and many people are able to hear, which is extraordinary and amazing. So that's an amazing account of brain hacking. I found a quick paper talking about some of the dangers. I mean, obviously there are dangers associated with surgery and stuff like that, but here this paper is talking about like how like a bad hacker could do some negative things. So for example, in a very critical time, they could remotely turn off it, and now the individual unexpectedly is deaf, or flush it with debilitating noise, or put little voices and stuff like that. So I mean, the main point here is that when you're intimately close to the brain, in this case the sensory nerve, you really can do things that can mess with a person and their sense of what is reality. Now getting even further away, outside of the sensory, like the brain, the nerves, now you're kind of like on top of the skull. You can stimulate the brain from outside. And there are a number of ways you can do this. You can do it through ultrasound. You can do it through near infrared light. Most of the papers that are out there are on TMS, which is transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is where you send a strong magnetic pulse, and that induces a current in the brain that can activate a part of the brain or kind of like disrupt it. And then there are a lot of papers on TDCS too, which is transcranial direct current stimulation. And this is, it's kind of wild. You just take a battery, stick two wires, like Frankenstein, stick it across your brain, and you just shock that brain. You send a current through it. Okay, so, with TMS and TDCS, there are studies that say that there are benefits, that you can hack the brain and enhance to a certain extent performance. As I looked at the review literature for TDCS, like there's some studies that are like, yeah, you can really hack it, and others are like, oh no, not so much. But long story short, this is not going to turn you into a super genius, but there may be some modest improvements, like if you shock your motor cortex, that you may be able to get maybe some improvements in skilled motor learning, maybe some improvements to memory tasks, other cognitive attention stuff, maybe. It may help, modest improvements in some cases with depression, maybe in some cases with Alzheimer's disease. What's kind of maybe frightening is that should any of you want to go and shock your brain tonight, you can buy it. You can buy it. You can send current through your brain, and no one knows if let's say you're trying to hack your brain multiple times a day for like a year, what is going to happen. For short duration in lab, it's safe, but you give this to someone else and they overuse it, who knows what can happen. Now again, on the side of dangers, this is a very interesting study where they used TDCS on a brain region not typically one that people use to hack performance, but this hacks the moral system. And what they kind of conclude here is that applying electric current can change moral judgments. Again, the findings are modest, so you're not turning someone from like good to evil, but you could statistically nudge them in a direction, especially with difficult moral decisions, by applying this current. And they're right here, most important, moral decision making is not a permanent individual trait, which is maybe contrary to what many people may assume, but it can be manipulated by this intervention. So again, like you could imagine a situation where for brain hacking purposes, people have this device, but someone with bad intentions could stimulate different parts of your brain. Now, getting further away, even from your brain itself, now on different sensory systems as a way of hacking what you're perceiving. We'll talk about sensory substitution. And sensory substitution is where you substitute one sensory system that may not be working with a sensory system that is working. A lot of it was popularized by Bach-Hirita. And his big catchphrase was that you don't see with your eyes, you see with your brain. And this is true. Like when visual information is coming in through your eyes, the eyes then kind of shatter that information, break it across different parts of your brain. There'll be some neurons that just respond to direction of stimuli, and others that just respond to movement. And then eventually get stitched back together somehow in your visual cortex. Now his idea was that, okay, let's say your eyes are not working, that visual information is coming in. What if you give that same information through a different sensory system? Well, the brain is plastic. What if a new connection could be formed and you could use your visual cortex to analyze this visual-like information that's coming through your skin, for example? So what he did is he took recently blind people, put them on this dentist chair, and gave them a movie camera. And the dentist chair, you can see this close-up view here. You see those little dots there? Those are solenoids. So those are little things that kind of poke your back. So then let's say this blind person moving the movie camera, and the movie camera sees a box. Well, this person then on their back gets a box-shaped poke. And then you move the camera, you see an X, then you'll get an X-shaped poke on your back. Or you see a person's face, which is what you see on the right there. You get a face-shaped poke on your back. And with like 100 hours of training, these individuals who are blind were able to identify many, many objects. Some were able to catch a ball. Some even reported the sensation of being able to see again in low resolution. Wow, that's pretty amazing. And later on, they made a more portable device where same exact idea, movie camera, but now instead of pokes, it was a little 12 by 12 grid of shockers that would shock your tongue. So if the movie camera saw an X, you get an X-shaped shock on your tongue. And these individuals were later on put into MRIs, and some of them showed activation of visual cortex. And so it's interesting that you can do this sort of thing where if one system is not working, you can kind of replace it with another system. And I kind of explore that in my own research. So my research is on spatial disorientation. This is when pilots and astronauts lose sense of their orientation. One example of that is that they lose sense of where up is, and this can be very dangerous. It's one of the leading causes of aircraft accidents where people are dying, fatal aircraft accidents. And part of what I study, is how astronauts will get disoriented. This is because most of my funding in the past has come through NASA, and astronauts, what's unique about their disorientation is that they cannot rely on gravitational information to determine their orientation. And they can use vision to look at meters and stuff, but usually vision is kind of overwhelmingly saturated. There's a lot of information. So a lot of what NASA was interested in was, can you convey information about orientation when someone's disoriented through vibrations on the skin? I have a whole YouTube video on that. It'll explain a lot better. Here I'm moving fast, so this is just an overview. So what I do, as some of you may know, is I strap people into this machine. They have to balance it. They're like a pilot almost. I put them in an orientation where they're disoriented. I call this my 0G analog condition. They cannot rely on gravitational information to figure out where that balance point is, similar to astronauts. And again, none of this will make sense right now because I need a full presentation for that. But the main takeaway is that I can disorient people similarly, and they can't use their inner ears, their vestibular system, to figure out where they are. So what do? Well, you see these little red circles in the arm, those are vibrotactors, little things that vibrate. The further you get from the balance point, the lower down it vibrates. And we were just exploring, can this help someone who can't use their vestibular system, gravitational cues, to determine where they are? And it turns out that yes, and I have a whole paper on that. It works. But there is conflict that arises because they're disoriented, they feel they're in one location, the vibrotactors are like, no, actually you're in this location. And how do you then follow what the vibrotactors are saying? So you have to develop a kind of like subcognitive trust below your level of cognition, like a gut level trust that you can rely on. And we developed a specialized program, around that. But really, some of the open questions here on human augmentation is like, what type of training do you need to feel merged, to feel one with the device? Are there any benefits to that? How do you develop this subcognitive trust in a stressful environment? How do you change perception itself? What will disrupt it? And to the right here is an image of a creative project that I was working on, exploring the same ideas in dance, where we augmented humans, giving them vibrotactile feedback. So if you're interested in that, you can message me. That's an ongoing project that I'm doing for fun, but asking the same questions as in my research. Okay, now we can get even further away from the sensory system and talk about non-technical, technological ways of hacking the brain. And most of these ways I've explored in different events in my backyard, which of course are free and open to everyone. So you guys are welcome to contact me. I have a little newsletter and everything. Even science now has found that meditation has dramatic effects to the brain, to psychology, to physiology. And so this is a very ancient way of hacking the brain, of fundamentally changing the way that we perceive things and interact with things. Similarly, I did an event on the subconscious, talking about what is the science of the subconscious and what tools can you use to hack your subconscious when you're dealing with things like trauma. And then we did an event on altered states of mind, and here we were exploring how to hack the brain, bring it into different states of mind without drugs or alcohol, using rhythmic-induced trance. And then finally, storytelling, narrative, ritual, all of these things are ancient methods that people use to change perception and to a certain extent performance. And so I'm happy to talk all about all of these things. Another very famous non-technological method is drugs, substances. Psychedelics have been used for thousands of years to hack into the brain. And just recently, neuroscience, has been allowed to use psychedelics again as a tool to study neuroscience. And there's a lot of promise there for things like PTSD, depression, hacking those systems of trauma. Of course, with everything, there's evidence that there can be negative impacts of psychedelics. If you're interested, there was a pretty bananas, outright crazy thing that was happening in the 1950s. A lot of weird things happened then, I guess. The CIA had a program called MK Ultra, and there was a mind control program. They used a bunch of drugs like LSD. They had all sorts of weird operations like Operation Midnight Climax, which is headed by a guy who would drink pitchers of martinis or margaritas or whatever it was, while trying to conduct I don't know if I'd call it a study, whatever it was, but he essentially had prostitutes who lured in clients, and then the clients, without their knowledge, were given LSD and all sorts of stuff, and then after the prostitutes had sex with them, and these people were watching this through a two-way mirror, or one-way mirror, whatever it's called, and then a two-way mirror probably, and then the prostitutes would try to convince or try to extract information from these people. So in any case, pretty wild stuff. So now we're entering into our conclusion. I went over a whole bunch of different ways to hack the brain. This is just a small amount, because the main conclusion is that you can hack the brain with pretty much anything. And what I mean by that is our brain is evolutionarily designed to be very hackable. And this is because it needs to be continuously adapting to changes in the environment. Part of what the brain does is it takes in sensory information and then compares it to an internal model of reality. And when there's a discrepancy between the sensory information that's coming in, from what you're observing and what you're expecting, your brain will try to update your internal representation of reality. And so it's very, almost any sort of sensory information has the capability of hacking the brain. And this is really important to think about. And I just want to give you one example of how plastic sometimes, or how hackable the brain can be. So in the lab that I'm in, the Ashton Graybill Spatial Orientation Lab, one of the things that they have a rotating room, and it's an artificial gravity simulator. You stand in this rotating environment, and when you try to reach, there's a non-contact Coriolis force that acts on you. You're not aware of this. So initially, if you're trying to reach, straight, your arm will deviate, and you'll be surprised. Your brain will register that error because you're trying to go straight and you didn't. And it will adjust the way that it is activating your muscles. So only after a few reaches, like a minute or two of reaching, you're back to complete normal. And you're not thinking about this Coriolis force anymore. Your brain has really gone through what they call sensory motor adaptation. Pretty amazing. And you turn that room off, you get a huge after effect. And you have to learn and come back to normal life. And there's evolutionary reasons for this. If you're out there in the wild and your muscles get damaged, you need to be able to quickly adapt and activate your muscles differently. Or even if your muscles get fatigued, you need to activate them slightly differently. So, or if you pick up a tool, then the physics of your movements are a little bit different. So this is why the brain is so hackable. Another example of this, from perception is the rubber hand illusion, which is a pretty famous illusion. I've experienced it. Surprisingly compelling, at least to me. And so what they do here is you have a participant sitting here. In this case, it's this woman who cannot see either of her hands. And instead what she sees is a rubber hand in front of her, and not her own. And what the experimenter does is strokes the rubber hand, but at the same time strokes her hidden hand, the one that she can't see. So what she's experiencing is a sensation of stroking, and she's seeing the rubber hand being stroked. You do this for a few minutes, and then the experimenter randomly will pick up a syringe or a hammer and stab that rubber hand, and she'll freak out a little bit. She'll flinch, and here's a graph of a biological response that's happening. So it's extraordinary that something as simple as that can hack our sense of ownership and the boundary between what is self and what is other. What this means is that this is not necessarily the fault of businesses. This is just what they do. But businesses are trying to hack our brains. They're trying to hack our reward system. The food industry creates delicious foods, and then we get in trouble because we get unhealthy. So every industry is trying to hack our brain. VR, AR, XR, they're all exploding, and with such high fidelity now that this is something that we really need to think about, because they're all trying to hack our brain. You look at Meta's early vision statement for VR, they wanted us to use that VR headset at work, at home, entertainment, education, all the time. And they wanted to collectively hack the reward system of humanity itself so that humanity would collectively invest a lot of money and resources into buying things like virtual clothes for their avatars. They were trying to motivate us to do that. So everyone is trying to hack our reward system. Social media is trying to hack our attention, and some of you may have heard of the term attention economics. And then AI potentially can hack our free will. Way before all the LLMs and ChatGPT, YouTube, not even initially on purpose, create an algorithm to optimize how long you'd stay on their platform. And part of what ended up happening was that the YouTube algorithm recommended more and more extreme videos. Now, to the person who was watching this, they were not feeling like they were being manipulated. They felt like they had full free will. But they're only being given a few options, and so you end up going down a path that you had no idea that you would. And so these are very easy ways, and now with ChatGPT, to nudge our sense of free will. And my last thought is that, look, our capability of hacking the brain is getting exceptional. It's growing like crazy to the point where it's going to be hard to tell the difference between reality and illusion. We're going faster and faster, 1,000,000 miles per hour, but where the HE double hockey sticks are we going? Where are we going? And I don't think there's a lot of discussion on that globally. And I think it's really important for us to have these philosophical questions on, what is the destiny of humanity? What is that humanity really does need? What does it want? And what are we trying to birth? I love collaborating, meeting new people, so definitely reach out. I've got all my social stuff there. There's a QR code to go and let me see if I can move this little Zoom thing so you can go and check out the stuff. Okay, so awesome.